The 1970s. Bigger, badder, safer, cleaner, more economical. The 1970s started with the peak of the muscle car era, but these cars didn't tend to sell well. They were expensive, they were not very economical, and really not all that practical. The first victim would be the Dodge Coronet. For 1971, the Super Bee would be moved to a Charger model along with the RT, and there would no longer be a high-performance version of the Coronet. The following year, the GTX would be the next victim, although the less expensive Roadrunner would continue on for several more years. When the mid-sized GM cars were redesigned, the muscle car variants carried over to the new body style, but only for 1 year. So for 1973, you could still get a Chevelle Super Sport or a Pontiac GTO. Although the Buick changed its name from Skylark to Century, there was still a GS model, but only for that 1 year. But Oldsmobile's 442 continued on. The GTO designation continued on at Pontiac for 1 year, but not on the existing car. It was used on Pontiac's new version of the Nova Super Sport, the Ventura GTO, but that too was only for 1 year. Roadrunner would continue on through the 73 restyling and the 75 restyling, but that would be the last year for the V-bodied Roadrunners. Like the GTO, the Roadrunner name would make a transition to the compact market on the Volare equivalent of the 360 Duster. The Charger would also continue on through the 75 restyling and would be joined by a Chrysler clone called the Cordoba. Back at Oldsmobile, the 442 would even continue on through the downsizing of 1978, although it was a shadow of its former self by this point. Since Ford didn't really separate their muscle cars from their more mundane mid-size cars, the big block GT variants would just simply continue on to the end of the Torino line. Even when the Torino became the LTD2, there were still big block performance options. And even when the muscle car names went away, most of these cars continued to offer big block options into the second half of the 70s. Pony cars were even hit harder. The new E-body Barracuda that was introduced in 1970, along with the slightly bigger Challenger, would only survive till 74, along with AMC's Javelin. In 1973, Ford went to an all-new smaller car for the Mustang that didn't even offer a V8 for the first year. And although the Camaro and Firebird would continue on through the end of the decade with only trim changes, the Camaro would have to survive on small blocks, with only the Firebird continuing on with big engine versions. Now, the first inclination is to blame the fuel crisis of 1973 on this disappearance, but the fact is these cars were already poor sellers by the time that happened. And contrary to popular belief, the fuel crisis did not have people buying smaller cars in droves. For most people, the concern wasn't how economical your car was, but where fuel was going to be available. And in the end, it wasn't popular demand that moved the market towards more economical vehicles. It was government regulation that forced it. In fact, government regulation was a big part of the 1970s auto industry. Fuel economy regulation actually derived from emissions regulation, and emissions and safety regulations were big driving factors in the 70s. In fact, these regulations were often quite contrary to mileage regulations, because safety and emissions regulations tended to add weight to vehicles, which hurt gas mileage. The fact is that full-size cars remained the best-selling segment in the U.S. well into the 1980s. And although the compact segment expanded greatly during the 70s, the cars were not really moving towards economy. In 1970, Ford replaced the Falcon with a car with updated styling called the Maverick and shortened the two-door version by 7 inches. But it wasn't shortened to make it a lighter, more economical car. It was shortened to try to keep it from competing with Ford's own Mustang. And a few years later, Mercury re-entered the segment with its own version reviving the Comet name, with Plymouth's Barracuda moving from the A-body to the E-body, an all-new A-body sport coupe was introduced called the Duster, and soon Dodge got its own version called the Demon. But unlike other Dart variants, the Demon actually used the shorter Valiant wheelbase. In 1973, GM expanded its compact segment by spreading Nova variants across the board, with Pontiac getting the Ventura, Oldsmobile getting the Omega, and Buick getting the Apollo. And in 1975, these cars actually got bigger, becoming the biggest compact cars of all time. And the Buick changing its name to Skylark from their previous midsize model. The same year, Ford introduced its upmarket compacts in the form of the Ford Granada, not to be mistaken with the European Ford Granada, and the Mercury Monarch, not to be mistaken with the Canadian Ford Monarch. 1976, Chrysler updated their compacts with a new bent front torsion bar suspension and greater glass area as the Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen. And before the end of the decade, Ford would replace the Maverick and Comet with the Fox-bodied Ford Fairmont and Mercury Zephyr, a segment that saw virtually no real downsizing during this decade. And although six cylinders were a prime aspect of the second, all of them continued to sell V8 versions, even AMC's Hornet. But if you wanted a four-cylinder, you had to go to the subcompact market. And again, this was not a response to the fuel crisis. The American automobile industry moved into this segment long before the fuel crisis. GM had started importing small cars from their European division Opel starting in the late 60s, selling them as Buicks. You may think that Buick is an odd choice for the division to sell these under, but GM tried to give the impression that since these cars were from Europe, they were more upmarket. And that included not just the small Cadet, but also the semi-sporty GT and Manta. Chrysler tried to do something similar by importing a car from one of their European brands, Hillman, and selling it as the Plymouth Cricket. But Ford jumped right into the subcompact market at the beginning of the 70s with the Pinto and totally dominated the class through the entire decade, in spite of a major recall for fuel tank placement and questionable build quality, mostly because the Pinto was more practical, more affordable, and even more reliable than most of its competitors, import and domestic. Naturally, GM was right there with the Vega. On paper, the Vega should have been the dominant competitor in this class, as it was a much more advanced and more stylish vehicle. Unfortunately, the aluminum four-cylinder that was designed for these cars was not up to the task, and engine failure turned into a major issue. And dropping in the older, heavier, yet more reliable Pontiac Iron Duke four-cylinder didn't happen soon enough to save its reputation. But that didn't prevent GM from expanding it into other divisions. Soon Pontiac got a version called the Astor. Then there was a restyled, sportier variation that included a V6 called the Monza, which expanded into the Pontiac Sunbird, the Oldsmobile Starfire, and the Buick Skyhawk. And soon performance options would include a turbocharged V6 and even a V8. And even the Pinto expanded to the Mercury division, being sold as the Bobcat, which by the end of the decade also came with a V6. But soon the American manufacturers had partnerships with Japanese brands and were rebadging Japanese cars as their own. Soon the Buick Opel was actually an Isuzu, and Mitsubishis started showing up at Chrysler as cars like the Dodge Colt and the Plymouth Arrow, which was not only sold as a sporty coupe, but also as a compact pickup, which the imports were also infiltrating the market with, as the American companies weren't building those. Mazda's B-Series showed up in the U.S. as a Ford Courier, and Isuzu's pickup, or PUP for short, arrived at Chevrolet dealerships as the light utility vehicle, or LUV for short. But it was the mid-size market that was really expanding. People who were looking for family cars still tended to opt for the much bigger, full-size sedan or wagon. And although there was some transition to the mid-size market, where the mid-size market was really expanding were the touring coupes, or intermediate personal coupes. When Chevrolet got a version of the 69 Grand Prix as the 1970 Monte Carlo, it changed how the class was viewed. And while the Charger already existed in this class, it was still very much more associated with muscle than luxury. But the Grand Prix and the Monte Carlo were successful enough that with the mid-size redesign of 73, Buick and Oldsmobile got their own versions as the Cutlass Supreme and Regal. When the Mustang was downsized in 73, instead of Mercury following suit with the Cougar was moved into the mid-size segment as an attempt by Ford to compete with these cars. And Ford got its own version in 74 called the Elite. And in spite of the Charger's popularity among the performance crowd, Chrysler followed GM's lead in 1975 with new styling that directly mirrored the GM cars. In 77, Ford decided that it needed to be more competitive in the segment, and the restyled Elite became the new Ford Thunderbird to join the Cougar in the segment. And just when it looked like Ford and Chrysler had caught up with GM downsized. But let's not forget that the popularity in this segment trickled down from the much more expensive personal luxury coupes. And at the beginning of the decade, GM still tried to lead the segment with styling, from the bottom-breathing Oldsmobile Tornado to the boat-tailed Rivieras. And although the Thunderbird would leave this segment towards the end of the decade for the much more profitable touring coupe segment, Lincoln would continue on with regular updates as the Mark IV and Mark V, even offering designer series. Surprisingly, with the popularity of all these luxury coupes, the convertible was falling from favor. Cadillac even went so far as to market a version as the last convertible, apparently ignoring all the tiny sports cars from Europe. And there were many styling cues that became popular in these luxury coupe segments, such as Landau tops and opera windows, and of course the short deck long hood, that carried into other segments, some more successfully than others. But the big styling change in the 70s on these classes and most others was the move from round to square headlights. Some companies got rather experimental with how to do this, and for a short period, the double-decker look became popular, and for some reason, Dodge felt the need to change the name of some of its cars with this transition, like the Coronet becoming the Monaco and the Charger becoming the Magnum, when really all that changed was some front-end styling and the addition of a few features. And although people tend to believe that it was the import compacts that were getting the American manufacturers' attention, it was actually the imported luxury cars that were getting the American manufacturers' attention. In fact, American luxury cars had gotten far too big to be considered competition for European luxury sedans, specifically cars like the big Mercedes. So in 1975, Cadillac introduced the Seville, a new, smaller, fully loaded Cadillac that was essentially a Chevy Nova with all of the features that you would come to expect from a Cadillac, charged more for it than they would a regular Cadillac, and pitted it directly against the big Benzes. And critics called it a home run. So naturally, Lincoln followed suit, offering their own version of the Ford Granada as the Lincoln Versailles. And at the end of the 1970s, the American manufacturers still totally dominated the U.S. market. But record sales and market share did not mean record profits. In fact, AMC and Chrysler were struggling just for survival. In spite of AMC's takeover of Jeep in 1970, which significantly padded their sales, they were still taken over by Renault before the end of the decade. Chrysler found itself selling off assets. The Imperial division was phased out in 1975. Their European divisions, known as the Roots Group, was sold to the French company Peugeot. Their Australian assets were sold to their Japanese partner, Mitsubishi, and it still took a government bailout to keep them from going under. Ultimately, all of the American companies needed to find ways to save money, and that meant cost-cutting. And ultimately, it's this cost-cutting that really led to downsizing. Fewer materials and resources meant it cost less to build each car. And naturally, they started with the biggest cars first, which created some odd overlap on dealerships as large cars were downsized and then sold beside mid-sized cars that were practically the same size on the outside, only for those cars to be downsized a year or two later to be as small as the compact cars they were being sold alongside. The cost-cutting meant more than just smaller cars. It also meant more cheaply made cars. And this trend of smaller, cheaper cars would continue on into the 1980s. And we will come back to that in our next video.
Mm-hmm.